right, so we just did our bell ringer. If you haven't done it yet, go back and do it. Now it's time for those guided notes. What are we going to learn about today? So today we're going to be able to construct explanations or just explain about how natural selection, which we talked about on Thursday, how that connects growth, survival, and reproduction to all of these things. So we're going to talk about these things in our notes today. So you should have this little slideshow pulled up and we're going to fill it in as we go. But first, let's review what we talked about on Thursday because we had a whole weekend. Our brains might be a little rusty. So on Thursday, we talked about this man named Charles Darwin from England. He was born a long time ago in the 1800s. He is a guy who studied nature in the Galapagos Islands, and he talked a lot about what we know today, which is called evolution. Evolution is where we get the word evolve, which means change. So evolution is just talking about how a certain population will change over a long period of time. And I'm talking like thousands to millions of years, a long, long time. And a population is just just a group of organisms in the same species. So in this case, it could be like rabbits living in one specific area. So maybe all of the rabbits that live in Como or all of the rabbits that live in Sardis, that is going to be one population of that species. So Darwin talked about how they have different variations, which we already know what that means. Variations are just different versions of the same trait. So in this case, we talked about beak size. You know, they all have beaks, but they all are shaped differently. They're different sizes because they need to get different food. We also talked about how certain traits help an organism be more successful or help them survive in a specific environment, and that is called an adaptation. And then we barely talked about this thing called natural selection. So natural selection is when a organism that has advantageous, which is just a good way of saying positive or beneficial, when they have those types of traits, they tend to survive and reproduce and pass those traits on down to their offspring, which is what causes evolution or that big change to happen in the first place. So that's kind of a lot. So we're going to break down natural selection today. How does that happen? What does that look like? So let's dive into it. How does natural selection actually happen? There are 4 main steps that are super important for this thing to go down. So first, we have to actually have reproduction happening. So that population of that species needs to have a mate and reproduce with their mate and create offspring. So in this case, we're going to look at a population of beetles. So these beetles are reproducing to make new beetles. Another super important part of natural selection is these offsprings need to have variations. Okay, so it's not just important enough that these beetles are reproducing, but the offspring that they are making are all looking differently because they are reproducing sexually. This is a throwback. If they reproduced asexually, they would be all identical and have no genetic variations. Right. So since these beetles are reproducing sexually, they have some of that genetic variation, meaning that they have different traits. So in this case, we have some beetles that are orange and some beetles that are green. Great. So what is step number 3? What's going to happen next? We are going to have a little bit of competition. What do we mean by that? So these beetles are just out here trying to survive. They're trying to make it through the day, right? However, there are some crows that love to eat these beetles. Rude. So these beetles are kind of in competition with each other on who cannot be eaten by these crows because no one wants to be eaten by a crow, right? So they are competing to see who can blend into their background the best. So in this case, the orange beetles blend in really, really well with that, I think it's branch that we're sitting on. So they are less likely to be seen because they are camouflaging into their background. That is an adaptation. So they're competing against the green beetles, and the green beetles are kind of easy to see on this wooden branch. And crows, they're kind of busy. They don't got the time to search for their beetles. So they're going to pick the ones that they can see first, and those are the ones that they are going to eat. Okay. So The orange beetles in this case are winning out in this competition. So over time, we're going to have the fourth step, which is selection, which is in the term natural selection. So that's pretty easy. So what do we mean by selection? Since the orange trait in this scenario, since the orange trait is the most beneficial or advantageous, this is the one that nature is going to select to be the best. So over time, more and more of the orange beetles are surviving. And since they are surviving, they are actually the ones that are going to find a mate. They're going to find a partner. They're going to be able to reproduce and make little beetle offspring. So since the orange beetles are the ones reproducing, that orange trait is what is going to be passed down to the offspring. So since we don't have that many green beetles reproducing and making more beetles, you're not going to see as many green beetles. So over time, the trait for the green color is going to slowly disappear. Okay, so we have, let's review that because that can kind of be a lot. We have a group of beetles. They are able to reproduce sexually, and they have genetic variation, meaning they have differences in their traits. There is some competition happening because they have a predator, in this case a crow, and it's going after a certain variation or a certain version of that trait. They're going after the green ones because they're not really blending into the background. Since the orange ones are surviving, that is the advantageous or beneficial trait. So they're the ones that are surviving and reproducing and making more orange beetles. So over time, orange is going to become more dominant in this population, and the green beetles, they're kind of going to die out. So another way you may have heard of natural selection be referred to is survival of the fittest. And that is exactly what is happening. So fitness is just a term that we use to talk about the ability of a certain organism to reproduce. So in this case, the orange ones, the orange beetles, they have a high level of fitness. Fitness isn't talking about like how physically fit you are. I mean, sometimes it does, but in this case, fitness is talking about, can you reproduce? Can you actually make an offspring? So the orange beetles, they have a high level of fitness. The green beetles, a low level of fitness. They're not very fit to the environment. Okay, so the rest of these slides, we are just going to talk about different factors that contribute or cause natural selection to happen. So like, what are certain things that are going to happen in an environment to cause this whole process to go down? So first, there are genetic factors. So these are just changes or mutations in your genes that can happen, that can be passed down to the next generation. So these are things that are going to be inherited by the offspring. A perfect example of what one genetic factor might be is if you look at ducks or different birds, they all have different types of feet. And these feet types can be inherited by their parents. And these types of feet aren't random, they're all very well suited to their environment. So if you think about a duck, they've got those little webbed toes, those little cute little feet, and those feet are what help them swim, because not all birds really need to swim, so they don't all need these types of feet. So it is beneficial for ducks to have a webbed foot so they can swim better. So this trait is going to be inherited or passed down to the offspring. Same thing if you look at this, I think it's an eagle. They have these kind of like talon-like claws which help them grip something quickly, which helps them get their food. So in this case, this eagle is swooping down to get that. I think it's a fish. It looks like an eel. I don't know, that's kind of scary to think about. But it helps them get their food more easily. So the type of feet that is something that can be passed down, that is a trait, it can be inherited, so that is a genetic factor. Another one, you'll probably hear about this. This will definitely come up in test questions. They love to throw this at you guys. Bacterial resistance. If you have a bacteria in your body that's causing you to be sick, some bacteria have a gene that is allowing them to resist or not be harmed by any antibiotics or medicine that we take. So basically, this piece of bacteria is able to survive even if you take that medicine. So since that bacteria is surviving, it's passing down that trait to its offspring when it reproduces. Because yes, bacteria does reproduce. So then its offspring, or the bacteria that it makes, is also resistant to antibiotics. That part might be a little confusing. If you are tripped up by that, let me know and I can explain it to you again, because it's kind of complicated. Moving on. All right, this one I think it's a little bit easier. We have environmental factors. So these are any changes that actually happen in the environment that causes certain phenotypes to become more fit. So one thing you can think about is precipitation, which is just a fancy way of saying rain or snow. If an environment suddenly gets a huge amount of, let's say, snow, that can change what phenotype might be most fit. So if it's suddenly, think about here, we don't get a lot of snow, but if suddenly something happened in our environment where we are walking around in a foot of snow, it's going to be more beneficial for animals with thicker fur because they're going to be able to stay warm in that cold. So they're more likely to survive. Or we can think about the rabbits again. Rabbits typically have brown fur, but if suddenly there's a bunch of snow, the lighter color fur is going to be more beneficial because they can blend into that snow and hide from certain predators. So a change in the environment can definitely impact what phenotype or characteristic is going to be the most useful. Another change in environment that can happen is pollution. If you have a bunch of trash suddenly dumped into a river, some organisms are probably going to die. So you want the organisms that have the best traits for maybe navigating their way through the trash, or just ones that can still find their food in this situation. Those are the ones that are going to survive. Okay, moving on. We have another factor called food intake. So this one's pretty easy. This is just the amount of food that is available for a certain organism, or the types of food that that organism can actually eat. So if you think about a bear, it's a perfect example. Bears can eat berries, so they can chomp on that fruit, or they can also eat fish. So let's say suddenly something happened to all of the berries in a certain population where these bears live. They wouldn't be totally out of luck. They wouldn't starve to death because they can still eat those fish. There are some living things that, maybe they can eat fish only. So if something happened to their one food source, they might be in trouble. So then the competition would really ramp up on who's going to survive because they wouldn't have as much food available for them to eat. Pretty easy. Last one, this one's my favorite one because I think it's the coolest to see. It's interactions with other organisms. So we typically think of predators when we think of this type of natural selection. So if you think about, maybe you've seen this video on, I think it's Planet Earth. It's one of the Earth documentaries where this lizard is being chased by all of these snakes. It sounds like my worst nightmare, but whatever. So the lizards who are the fastest, they are going to be able to survive, because if they're slow, they're going to be eaten by one of these snakes. They're kind of out of luck. They're not going to be able to have a family, make any kids. Tragic. So whatever predators or prey are available in the area, that's definitely going to affect a population. Or you may have seen examples of these before. There's something called sexual selection. So different organisms will try different things to attract a mate so they can actually reproduce. Because even if you're surviving a predator, you have all the food, this organism might still just not be able to find somebody to reproduce with. Isn't that sad? So different species will go through different things to attract a mate. Usually it has to do with the color of their feathers or their fur. If they have some bright, fancy feathers going on, that's just a way to attract a mate. Or a lot of, especially birds, they'll do different mating dances. This one's a little freaky, to attract a female. It's the same thing that people do. You kind of want to be blingy. Some people are better able to attract mates if they can sing or if they can dance well. It's the same thing. I attached a video to this bird doing its whole mating dance because it's really funny and it's interesting. And they do all kinds of crazy things other from dancing to attract a mate. Okay, so all of these things are different things that can happen or different things that organisms will do that will cause natural selection or the changing of the fitness of a population, what traits are going to be most suitable. Those all contribute to this whole process. So if you have any questions about any of this, because I know natural selection can be kind of tricky, just let me know. We're going to practice it tomorrow. See you then.